In this lecture, we'll discuss the game world, that is, the world in which the player plays. In a previous lecture, I introduced the Design Play Experience framework. We'll be using this as a sort of guide over the next few lectures. The focus for today will be on storytelling and gameplay, as the game world has both elements of storytelling and gameplay. Let's start with a quote. In a time, in a place, as a game designer, you play the role of a god with the power to create new worlds in which your players will exist. This was said by the legendary game designer Will Wright, who's known for creating some of the most interesting game worlds in games like SimCity, The Sims, and Spore. So let's formally define what a game world is. Ernest Adams said, "A game world is an artificial universe, an imaginary place in which the events of the game world occur." We'll do a few game design challenge activities today as we discuss game worlds. Some of these challenges will be thought challenges, such as analyzing a game, and some may require some activity, such as playing or designing a game. Many may require both thought and activity to get the most out of them. Please participate in the activity if you can. And here's the first. So let's look at another simple game, rock, paper, scissors. The rules state that 2 or more players pair up. In synchronization, the players say 1, 2, 3, and then throw. On throw, each player makes one of the following hand shapes, either a rock, a paper, or scissors. I'm sure all of you have played this at some time in your life. The game is resolved by using the following three-way intransitive relationship. Rock crushes or beats scissors, scissors cuts or beats paper, and paper covers or beats rock. Take a moment to think about the following questions. Does rock, paper, scissors have a game world? If so, what is the game world? Of course there's a game world, defined by the mechanics of the game. There's even a storytelling component of rock, paper, scissors, derived from the relationships of the characters in the game. In fact, the backstory of rock, paper, scissors was expanded upon and made into a children's illustrated book by Drew Daywalt and Adam Rex called The Legend of Rock, Paper, Scissors. When you're playing rock, paper, scissors, you really care about where your opponent's hands are. If they are counting in sync with you, if they're revealing their hand shape at the same time as you, and so on. This psychological state of being immersed in the game is sometimes referred to as the magic circle of the game. You give yourself over to the rules of the game, play within those rules, care that the others in the circle are playing within those rules as well. The game world helps define this psychological state of being for the players. Once the game is over, the players leave the magic circle and stop caring about the rules of the game. Further, there's also the concept of breaking the magic circle. This is similar to the concept of breaking the suspension of disbelief in a narrative. Breaking the magic circle diminishes the experience of the game. It could be caused by a player not following the rules, otherwise known as cheating, a player not being immersed in the game world, also known as not role-playing, maybe some technical glitch in the game, or any number of other interruptions. Overall, the idea of creating a strong magic circle is an important one for game designers. In fact, Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman in their book Rules of Play define the term illusory attitude to describe this. The illusory attitude is the state of mind required to enter into the play of the game. To play a game, a group of players accepts the limitations of the rules because of the pleasure a game can afford to them. Once again, this concept is very similar to the concept of willing suspension of disbelief we see in storytelling, but this term uniquely applies to games as it integrates the players' interactions into the game. As we look at game worlds, they typically boil down to two primary components. Those components are boundaries and setting. When we look at boundaries, they can be considered primarily part of the game mechanics or rules of the game. Boundaries are often defined by space and time. For example, in a game like blackjack, the position of the cards, chips, and players mean a lot. The people standing in the back are not players. The players are at the table. The chips right next to the player are not yet bet or in play. The chips that are placed toward the dealer are bet and in play and cannot be removed while the game is playing out. If the player has their hands on the table, they can signal the dealer, for example, to give them another card. This all relates to space. Time is also an important element of the game. You can only place your initial bets before the cards are dealt. You cannot signal to get another card or be hit until it's your turn, etc., etc. Space and time define the boundaries of this game. American football, or almost all sports, are also defined by their boundary conditions of space and time. Players need to be in certain positions at certain times in the game for play to proceed, or a penalty will occur. A lot of learning of a sport is the understanding of the boundary conditions of the game. If the boundaries are the mechanical side of the game world, the setting is the fictional or fantasy component of the game world. That is, one of the purposes of the game world is simply to entertain in its own right, to offer the player a place to explore and an environment to interact within. Ernest Adams said this best when he said, "When the player enters the magic circle and pretends to be somewhere else, the game setting is the place she pretends to be." To that end, the game setting should define the reason things are the way they are in the game world. The setting influences many aspects of the game, including the characters and story, the nature of the game world, which often translates into the aesthetics or appearance of the world to the players. Even though the setting is typically part of the storytelling, it can influence and often does influence the game mechanics. The setting is one way to communicate to and to teach the player. For example, if the game setting is a farm, your player can assume they are doing farm-related things. The setting gives them context to their actions they will be performing in the game. So let's think about the game of chess for a moment. Chess is largely defined by the boundary conditions of space and time. We have a chess board, we know where the pieces start, and the limitations on how each piece moves, creating an explosion of possibilities as the game plays out, leading to deep strategy and interesting gameplay. But does chess have a game setting? And if so, what is it? Certainly, most versions of chess are based on a sort of medieval battle backstory, with the pieces called things like kings, queens, knights, and bishops. But does the setting enhance the experience of playing chess? Does it enhance the entertainment value of the game? Well, for some players, I definitely think the setting matters. Why else would people buy other versions of the game? For example, for some players, playing the Harry Potter version of chess enhances the fantasy or entertainment value of playing chess altogether. Just look at the first-person shooter genre. There are many games that have very similar game mechanics, but one is set in World War II, while another is set in a sci-fi futuristic fantasy. Certain players may be attracted to one over the other. For another example, look at all the Pac-Man clones out there, where the game mechanics are the same, but the game setting has changed. The game has essentially been reskinned. Some players may be more inclined to play a new version of the game because they love Cookie Monster or Spider-Man or Mario. As a thought question, when is a game a clone versus simply an example of a genre? Is Pac-Man a genre of a game like the first-person shooter example I mentioned previously, or is there something different? Perhaps just changing the setting isn't enough. We must also change the game mechanics in some way not to be a clone. In any case, I thought this was an interesting thought question, as we don't want to just create clones of other games as we design new ones. For another thought question for you related to game setting and mechanics, Ernest Adams said, as a general rule, the more a player understands a game's core mechanics, the less the game setting matters. Do you agree with this statement? If you think of games that have been used heavily in esports, such as StarCraft and League of Legends, I think this argument holds. For these players, they just care about how quickly they can perform tasks to compete at the highest level possible. It literally becomes mechanical for them, and the setting often melts away. A counter-argument, though, is for the type of player that is perhaps learning one of these games. They invest a ton of energy in learning the mechanics, but once they master the mechanics, then they just play and enjoy the setting, perhaps getting into the backstory of the world and its characters. In any case, I think the individual player and the play setting matter a lot. Let's now discuss the design side of the game world. To do this, we'll break the game world into the following dimensions: including the physical dimension, the temporal dimension, the environmental dimension, the emotional dimension, and the ethical dimension. As I discuss these dimensions, as a thought activity, I want you to pick a game that exists that you know very well. Pick something that's, a little deeper. Don't just pick a simple arcade game or a simple puzzle game, but pick something like an adventure game, a role-playing game, a real-time strategy game, something that you know very well once again. And then think about the dimensions of your game in particular to ground the concepts that I'm discussing. Go ahead and pick that game now. So let's start with the physical dimension. The physical dimension defines the area the player plays within. You can think of this as the game board, the game level, or the game map. The physical dimension is further defined by the game's dimensionality, scale, and boundaries. Let's talk about each of these. When I think of the dimensionality of the game world, I immediately think, is the game's graphics 2D or 3D? This is a very important decision that often has more to do with the technology you're using and the team's skill set than anything else. But from a game design perspective, it's probably more important to think about the conceptual dimensions of the game. For example, in a game like SimCity, there are the dimensions of the zoning of the land as residential, industry, or commercial. There's the road system dimension, there's the electrical system dimension, and so on. These conceptual dimensions all enhance the game world, but they do not directly relate to the game being 2D or 3D. For example, the first few versions of SimCity were built entirely on 2D engines, even though they were multi-dimensional games. Another important aspect of the physical dimension is the scale of the game world. One way to think about scale is to think about the size of the physical game world. For example, many classic arcade games were single-screen games. That is, the player could see the entire game world they were playing within at one time. This is still a popular approach for many puzzle games today. Beyond single-screen games, there are scrolling screen games, where the world is bigger than the single screen the player can see. And as the player moves, the world scrolls to the left, to the right, up, and or down. And of course, there are 3D world games where the player can move in X, Y, and Z directions. As the scale of the world expands, it may require you to create multiple views on the world, such as a mini-map to see the overall world, and a zoomed-in view on specific objects to control them or offer direct commands to those objects. I've been talking about the overall scale of the game world, but there are also the scale of the objects in the world and the relationship between those objects. For example, look at the screenshot from this 1985 game called Ultima 4. You can see how primitive the graphics were at this time. The player character is represented in the middle. You can see grasslands around him, forest, water, as well as a town and a city. What is strange about the scale of the objects in this screenshot? And why do you think they implemented the scale of the objects in this way? There are many reasons to distort game objects. In the example of Ultima 4, certainly there were technological limitations. For example, there were not enough pixels to represent the characters, so they scaled him up so you can tell he was a humanoid character. But size distortions are used by designers even in modern games when there are no such technological limitations. This is done to emphasize critical objects such as keys over non-critical objects, or to make the game more functional. On a small touchscreen, for example, you may need to make an element larger so they're more tappable. There are also numerous other gameplay reasons to distort sizes. Okay, we've talked about the dimensionality and scale of the physical dimension. Let's finish up talking about the physical dimension by discussing boundaries. I spoke about boundaries earlier, but let's now look at it from a game world design perspective. It's often not practical or even desirable to make your game world infinite. Therefore, you need to create boundaries for the player. So the question is, how do you define these boundaries? Let's look at the classic board game Risk as an example. How are boundaries defined in Risk? Well, we have the boundaries between countries, the ocean creates a natural boundary between the continents, and the designers added artificial crossing points to enable gameplay, like for example between Brazil and West Africa. And of course, the world is a sphere and not a flat surface, despite what some people think. And this is signified through a wraparound connection between Alaska and eastern Russia on the game board. This demonstrates many of the types of boundaries we see in games today. We have natural boundaries like mountains and water that the player cannot cross. We have unnatural boundaries such as walls of buildings or maybe edges of roads that the player cannot deviate from. We have wraparound worlds where the world is treated as a sphere like we saw in Risk. We have the concept of out of bounds. This is used often in sports games where there is a defined field or defined course that you're playing upon. And then we also just have the edge of the world, where the player is literally stopped from proceeding in a direction, often by an invisible barrier. This is the least desired, as it could break the player's illusory attitude if they run into an invisible wall. So as a thought activity, take a few minutes to think about, discuss, and document the physical dimensions of your chosen game. Think in particular about the dimensions of the game, the scale of the game, and the objects within that game, and the boundary conditions of the game. Of course, you could describe these things through maps and diagrams or descriptive text. Let's continue to look at the dimensions of the game world, moving on to the temporal and environmental dimensions. The temporal dimension defines how time is treated in the game world. This is often defined as turn-based, where each play segment is divided into turns, or real-time, where time passes as the player plays. Of course, there can be some combination between turn-based and real-time. For example, in competitive chess, there may be a time limit on a player's turn. Or in a real-time game, there may be a point where the game is paused while the player engages in dialogue or sorts through their inventory. With real-time games, there are several additional considerations related to time. For example, is the clock in the game synchronized with world time? That is, 1 second in the game is 1 second in the world. Or does the game time run at different rates? Is the game time subdivided into sections like rounds, quarters, halves, or periods, like we see in mini sports or fighting games? Is there day-night cycles or seasonal cycles that further represent the passing of time? Is there variable time, where the overall game time is sped up or slowed down to enhance gameplay? Is there ever things in the game that run on irregular time? That is, time that seems to move at irregular speeds in different parts of the game at the same time. For example, in a real-time strategy game, it may take time to gather resources, but then buildings just pop up immediately when you try to build them. Overall, there's a lot of design decision when it comes to controlling time in real-time games. If you've ever played one of the versions of The Sims, take a second to think about how time is handled. Alfred Hitchcock is credited with the famous quote, "Drama is life with the dull bits left out." The Sims is just the opposite. It is all about the dull bits of life, like cooking, cleaning, and going to the bathroom. Basically, it is a game about time management. What makes the game challenging is that the game clock runs 48 times faster than real life, but the movement speed of characters is fairly accurate to real life. This creates a heightened sense of time pressure as you play the game, and it leads to an entertaining experience as you direct your Sims to answer the door while nature comes calling. So now take a few minutes to think about, discuss, and document the temporal dimensions of your chosen game. You may describe the temporal dimension through diagrams, flowcharts, timelines, or descriptive text. The environmental dimension describes the game world's appearance and atmosphere. You do this as a game designer by thinking about the cultural context of the game. To some extent, you need to play the role of an anthropologist, studying the humanity of your virtual game world. What are the beliefs, attitudes, and values of the people in the world? This reflects itself on the clothing that they wear, the architecture that's around them, the furniture, the landscaping, and so on. Ultimately, you're deciding what the game actually looks and sounds like, which of course is influenced by the cultural context. It's akin to building a house. There are literally 1 million decisions to make. What objects exist in the world? What do they look like? How are they placed? What is the lighting like? Who lives in the world in terms of both players, non-player characters, and other beings, such as animals? And what does the world sound like? Obviously, this is a team effort between the game design team, art team, and sound team on the game project. Take a few minutes to think about, discuss, and document the environmental dimension of your chosen game. Describe the environmental dimension through concept sketches, maybe photos of example locations if the game is based on the real world, and descriptive text. Let's conclude looking at the dimensions of the game world by looking at the last two dimensions, the emotional and ethical dimensions. In terms of the emotional dimension of the game world, Is the world at war? Is there an asteroid about to hit the planet and all life is threatened? Or does the game take place on a peaceful, deserted island? The emotional dimension also relates to what emotions you wish to arouse in your players. Are you trying to create a suspenseful, exhilarating, exciting experience, or something more calming, serene, and relaxing? What emotions do your players expect or seek out? We talk about players wanting a game to be fun, but what is fun? We'll talk a lot more about this later in the course. But does a game need to be fun to be entertaining? I watch a lot of movies that are sad and don't have a happy ending, for example. Have games moved beyond just being about fun? Can we make a game that makes players feel across the breadth of human emotion, like motion pictures do? I believe modern games have moved beyond just fun. We have games where we feel pity, anger, sorrow, guilt, outrage, despair, and remorse, in addition to pleasure, surprise, and gratitude. And finally, let's discuss the ethical dimension of the game world. That is, what does right and wrong mean within the context of the game? You define the morality of your world based on the role the player takes on and the goals and sub-goals in the game. You can also allow the player to make moral choices so that they can decide how they want to play the game, such as games like Fallout or BioShock. In the past, we've seen games get into political trouble at times. Ernest Adams once said, "Games get into political trouble when they have a close visual similarity to the real world, but an ethical dimension that is strongly divergent from the real world." If you make a game about killing aliens with green blood, no one will likely care. If you make a game about killing real people in real locations, you likely will attract a lot of negative attention. Once again, you have a lot of power as a game designer. You need to understand that if you wield this power in certain ways, it can lead to issues. Take a few minutes to think about, discuss, and document the emotional and ethical dimensions of your chosen game. You can describe emotional and ethical dimensions through illustrations, such as storyboards, or descriptive text. The role of the game designer is to develop the dimensions of the game world we just described, understand how the dimensions will influence the game, and build a coherent game world where all the dimensions fit together to create an immersive environment where the players can reasonably maintain the illusory attitude. The game world influences and is influenced by all other components of the design. We'll continue to talk about these other components in subsequent lectures. Hello once again. This lecture is about storytelling in games. We'll be looking at the storytelling layer of the design play experience framework in detail. Remember, based on the framework, the designer designs a story, which is referred to as the designer story. The player plays the game, where the storytelling actually takes place. The player then leaves with the experience that they had within the game, which results in the player's story. The designer will have goals for the player's story they want the player to experience, but the actual player story may vary greatly from the designer story, based on the choices the player makes while playing. It's also interesting to note that not all games have a designer story, but all will have a player story. For example, think of the game Tetris. What is the designer story in Tetris? And what is the player story? I would argue that Tetris does not really have a designer story, at least in the original classic Tetris game. There is not even really a backstory on who the player is or why they're doing what they're doing in the game. However, I would argue that Tetris does have a player story. That is, the player story is the story of how their individual game played out. For example, first I got an I piece, then a block piece, then an L, and I almost completed a row, but then I got a T piece and I accidentally dropped it in the wrong spot, and then I had to work hard to recover from that. It's not a very interesting story, but it is a player story nonetheless. For today, we're going to talk about games that clearly have a designer story, which is most, but not all games. Let's start by discussing what makes an effective story. The story must be credible. That is, does it maintain the willing suspension of disbelief? The story must be coherent. The events in the story must not be irrelevant or arbitrary. And the story must be dramatically meaningful. The receiver of the story has to care about what's going on and the characters involved. As a thought activity, think about what stories you've recently consumed. It could be a book, a movie, TV show, or video game. Was it a good story or a bad story? Think about how your rating of the story quality correlates to your thoughts on the story's credibility, coherence, and dramatic meaningfulness. Okay, we said an effective story is credible, coherent, and dramatically meaningful, but what are the parts of a good story? I once heard that good stories are made from interesting people in interesting places doing interesting things. Said in another way, we have interesting characters in interesting settings with an interesting plot. Character, setting, and plot are the three parts of stories that we'll be discussing today. Let's continue our discussion of storytelling in games by talking about characters. It is said that characters are often the most important part of a story because usually what people care about most is other people. In games, characters attract players to the game, provide an element of fantasy for the player through the ability to roleplay the character, provide the player with a bridge to move from one game to a sequel, and of course, characters are an integral part of the game and the story in the game. They are the vehicle through which the story is often told. Let's do a brief history of game characters, starting with what I am calling the primordial ooze of game characters. These are games pre-1984, where the focus was mostly on gameplay, as we were just figuring out digital games and what was possible given our primitive computing hardware at the time. Our graphics were low resolution with limited number of colors. While the original games just had the player controlling a ship or a paddle, we started to have our first named characters during this time, like Pac-Man, Mario, and Pitfall Harry. The characters were one-dimensional characters. That is, the characters only displayed one discrete emotion at a time, and there was no real character growth across the game. For example, Pac-Man at the end of the game was the same as Pac-Man at the beginning of the game. The next era I have dubbed the early ages of game characters, representing the 10-year span from 1984 to about 1993. This signifies a big shift from the arcade to the home. Rather than arcade machines that were trying to promote quick gameplay and coin drop to continue playing, we now had games running on home PCs and consoles. The cost of the games was paid up front, and players expected more playtime for their investment. This led to the integration of more story into games. We had the rise and popularity of new game genres like adventure games and role-playing games. Of course, technology was advancing, and we now had slightly better graphical resolution and colors to work with. For example, this screenshot is of the original King's Quest circa 1984. Given all of this, games started to have more defined characters, and the characters began to transition from one-dimensional to multi-dimensional characters to reflect the more complex stories being told. The next dozen years, from about 1993 to about 2004, I'm dubbing the Middle Ages of game characters. Our technology had advanced, so we had higher resolution, the ability to display more colors, and the ability to process things at a rapid rate so we can have more animation. This resulted in much better ability to represent game characters visually. We also had more storage capabilities, with the transition from the floppy disk drive to CD-ROM and then eventually to DVD. This allowed for things like voice acting, motion capture data, and pre-rendered cutscenes. Overall, we had deeper stories and more variety in characters. A good example of a game from this era is Tim Schafer's Full Throttle. The modern age of game characters began around 2005 with the release of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The focus of games at this time was on realism and cinematic representation, elevating game characters to the level of depth and detail of movie characters. I would like to play you a short documentary on the making of Uncharted, which was released in November 2007. As you watch it, think about how the team at Naughty Dog defined the characters and brought them to life in the game.
We drew a lot of our inspiration for our characters from the classic pulp action adventure stories that you've seen in books and movies and comics.
One of the hallmarks of this genre is the fact that you have a very relatable hero who's kind of an everyman.
All of the heroes are really recognizable human beings with all of our strengths and flaws. And we figured out that that was something very important for helping audiences connect with the character.
This is finally it.
It's not just the fact that you have chases and gunfights and a heroine and all this other kind of stuff. It's the fact that the characters are real people. They can make mistakes, but be heroic.
Nathan Drake is our hero, and he's the kind of guy who knows how to handle himself in a tight situation. But he's really just a guy in a t-shirt who finds himself in a difficult situation and has to rely on his wits a lot to save the day. Elaine is a really cool character. I think she's something a little bit new and different for video games. She's a bright, self-sufficient young woman. She's very curious. She has this strong intellectual drive, has a kind of unconventional beauty. And there's this immediate chemistry between her and Nathan that really helps drive the story forward.
What's going on?
Pirates.
Pirates?
Then there's the character of Victor Sullivan. He's kind of that guy's guy adventurer. He's the consummate con man in a world of con men.
There's nothing here, Nate. Let's just keep that between us.
What makes this game truly next-gen has been the focus that we're doing on movement. What we found is that it's Drake's imperfections that make him believable. It's him stumbling, it's him not perfectly landing correctly every time. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with him is make him a kind of an everyman put into an extraordinary situation.
PlayStation 3 is like, you know, allowing us to do these amazing things runtime. We're hitting over, I mean, easily over 30 frames a second in some complex environments that have all this wind gusting around, and it can be this nice little breeze, and we can then push through an actual gust that like churns it up a little bit and then it settles back down.
To achieve cinematic quality, we looked at a lot of foams and the kind of things they were doing. One of the things in foam that we weren't able to do on the PS2 that we're able to do on the PS3 now is they have complex shaders and complex rendering techniques. That allows us to create multiple layers of textures that we can pipe into a shader that gives us complex skin.
The PlayStation 3 really opened up the floodgates for us to achieve the goals that we wanted to with the animation. We need much more CPU power than we've ever had before. And the amount of memory that we have to work with now just really allows us to have the quantity and quality that we need, especially with the layers that we're doing and all the processes that are going on right now. It just could not be done in any other way.
The RSX chip is the graphics chip, and without that sucker, you couldn't do any of this stuff. PlayStation 2 was extremely powerful for pushing a lot of polygons, and this generation it's all about shaders, and what the RSX chip allows us to do is have these complex shader instructions pushed through relatively quickly and drawn pixel for pixel, drawn very quickly as well.
We have the power now to really take on human characters and make them believable. This is something that, you know, was an incredibly overwhelming task, but we really took on head first. The PS3 was able to allow us to create subtleties that we wouldn't be able to do previously. Skin detail, pore detail, have, you know, anatomically correct body structures, elaborate facial expressions. These are all things that the power of the PS3 has really allowed us to actually create.
One of the things that makes Drake so lifelike is the sheer volume of animations that we're doing on this game. We're doing about 10 times more than we've ever done in the past, which is huge. I mean, it's a huge step, 10 times the amount of animation.
Skin movement plays a huge role in keeping humans alive, and when that skin moves, it creates wrinkles. So we really knew that one way or another we had to get wrinkles in. We wouldn't be able to have dense enough geometry to create modeled-in wrinkles, so we basically figured out a technique of wrinkle mapping that generates wrinkles through textures. If Drake lifts up his brows, one brow up and the other brow down, he's going to get two different areas of wrinkles in his face based on how the muscles either expanding or contracting. That technology has really allowed us to create convincing characters that when they emote, you really get a sense for the certain poses that they're creating.
For the first time in Uncharted, we actually had to cast actors who had stage or TV or film experience because we were doing motion capture for all of our cinematic cutscenes. So we have real stage and film actors coming in, getting in the motion capture suit, recording their voice while they're acting out the scene, which I think is really important because you capture that moment rather than having them try to pantomime to some voice dialogue they've already recorded.
physicality that's demanded in doing motion capture and creating, you know, an action film, essentially, has been tricky. All the stunt work we have to do here, I mean, I go, is this my job? This is so much fun. But at the same time, the next day, I'm like, oh my word, I am so incredibly sore.
Well, I think the coming together of film, stage, and video and games is happening right here on the mocap stage. I really stage things as if I was doing a play or a scene from a movie.
I had no experience. I was flying by the seat of my pants the whole time, scared to death, and having a great time. You know, in front of a camera for film or for TV, you've got a set, and the other actors that are there with you are in their costumes. Here, you all look very silly. You look like you're wearing a wetsuit with dots on it. And so it really requires you to exercise your imagination even more.
It's like the three of us have this treehouse that we built and we're doing missions, and it really makes you feel like you're on an adventure.
I have a 7-year-old little boy who asked me, Dad, what do you do? And I said, well, you remember when your buddy came over the other day and you guys ran around the backyard and the clubhouse became a pirate ship and you were jumping off? And he said, yeah. I said, that's what I do.
The hell?
We also spent a lot of time developing systems that allowed us to emulate muscle structure inside of the body. So when the character actually flexes his arm, there's a bicep bulge. When he moves around, his chest actually has volume and form to it. So we created underlying joint structures that actually emulated muscles, and now when Drake moves around, he has a solid mass, a solid form, and he really feels like a believable character that's there and it's tangible.
A lot of the ways that we're able to tell the story is through the environment, through the other characters in the scene.
Don't you guys usually just cut off a finger or something?
We don't have to cut to a cutscene in order to deliver a line of dialogue or a story or things that we want to portray to kind of lead the character on and lead Drake and the player on to the bigger story that's unveiling. So all that will happen while you're playing the game.
We also looked at a lot of rendering techniques that take place in film, post-blur effects, specific lighting per character, soft shadows. All of these things is what really brings cinematic quality characters to life, and we try to emulate those things in the game.
Let's continue to look at game characters, focusing on the design of the characters. There are two primary types of game characters: player characters, or what some people call avatars, and non-player characters, often abbreviated as NPCs. Player characters can be non-specific, generic things like the ship in Asteroids, or predefined characters fully fleshed out by the designers, like Nathan Drake in Uncharted. You may also have a player design character, where the game employs an avatar builder that allows the player to customize the appearance of the character, among other attributes. This is most important in massively multiplayer games, where you may have many players in the game at one time. Non-player characters include any character controlled by the computer and not a player. This can include enemies, which are sometimes categorized as grunts, mini-bosses, and bosses. It can also include allies, which may help the player in some fashion, or just be around to help advance the story. Or it could be other extras in the game. Extras are often used to show the player emotions that the hero is not allowed to show, such as reactions to events. A good film example of this is in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. There's a scene where Indiana Jones comes face to face with a scary swordsman who brandishes his weapon, preparing for what seems to be an epic duel. Instead, Indiana shoots the swordsman in a nonchalant fashion. The emotions of the scene is conveyed by the extras in the background surrounding Indy. At first, they're going crazy, ready for the duel, and then they end in stunned silence after Indy shoots the swordsman. This sort of use of extras to communicate the emotion of the scene to players is now being employed in modern video games. Another important thing to define is the role of the character. Are they a hero, also known as a protagonist, or are they a villain, also known as an antagonist? Of course, this is a simple way to think about game characters. A more sophisticated way to think about characters is to think about them as character archetypes, which are classical types of characters based on human nature. Joseph Campbell, in his seminal text, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, helped define these character archetypes based on his analysis of mythology. The 8 character archetypes shown here come from what Campbell referred to as the hero's journey. In parentheses, I've placed Star Wars characters into each archetype as an example. Often when defining a character, you'll come up with a backstory for the character. What is their history? Where did they come from? Basically, what led up to where we find them in the story? What are their beliefs, their quirks, their relationships, and their motivations? Overall, this background information helps the designer understand how the character fits into the story and how they'll react in given situations as the story plays out. Of course, characters need to have names, and hopefully the names are interesting and memorable, fit the nature of the character, are marketable, and not overly cliche. Some great names include Duke Nukem, Lara Croft, Nathan Drake, and Kratos. All of these fit the characteristics I just defined. The look of the character also must be defined. Often designers will work with concept artists to bring the vision of the character through concept art, sketches, and illustrations. Model sheets create guidelines for the look of the character from different angles and poses to help with animating the character. And storyboards show sequences of the interactions the character will have during the game. Another element of defining the character is giving the character personality through things like props or clothing, movements, maybe they have a limp or a special action move in the game. Personality can also be brought out through dialogue or the language of the character and how they speak it. For example, in Star Trek, Vulcans never speak with contractions. Some games may warrant catchphrases such as Duke Nukem's "Come get some." This, of course, relates to how the voice of the character sounds, especially if you have voice actors acting out the characters. As you can see, there's a lot to defining interesting characters. Now that we've examined characters, let's move on to the 2 other parts of a story. As a reminder, we said good stories are about interesting people in interesting places doing interesting things, or characters, setting, and plot. The setting defines the reason things are the way they are in the story, including the backstory, the nature of the world or the aesthetics of the world, and of course the setting may also influence the game mechanics. And guess what? We already talked about the setting because the setting is part of the game world, which we discussed in a previous lecture. So let's move on to plot. Robert McGee, in his book Story, said, "To plot means to navigate through the dangerous terrain of story, and when confronted by a dozen branching possibilities, to choose the correct path. Plot is the writer's choice of events and their design in time." This sounds like a great definition for the designer story that we discussed previously. John Gardner in The Art of Fiction states that there are only 39 different plots, but there are an infinite number of stories. We just vary the setting and characters and reuse the same plots over and over again. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but it's an interesting idea. You literally have heard thousands of stories in your lifetime. Most people develop a strong visceral sense of story quality, based on both what happens or the flow of the story and how it happens or the story details. So how do we generate a quality story? Ken Adams developed the story spine. This is a storytelling template. It helps you create well-built narratives that have good story flow. It allows you to concentrate on the details of the story without concern of the process. The story spine goes like this. Once upon a time. This is the platform that introduces the setting and the main characters. Every day, the platform continues and develops. But one day, this is the catalyst that launches the story. Why is today different from any other day? It's the reason the story is being told. Because of that, this is the heart of the story, the consequences that ensue from the catalyst. Each event leads to another event, building suspense and tension. You repeat because of that as many times as needed, until finally, this is the climax of the story. And ever since then, this is the resolution, the moral of the story. Let me give you an example of a story using the story spine. Once upon a time, in an Italian city, there were 2 prominent families who despised each other. Every day, the families feuded, fought, and killed each other's members. But one day, the son of one of the families crashed the birthday party of the other's daughter. Because of that, the son and daughter fell in love. Because of that, they secretly married. Because of that, the son wanted the killing to stop. Because of that, he stepped into the middle of a fight and inadvertently caused the death of his best friend. Because of that, in agony and rage, he killed the killer, his wife's cousin. Because of that, he was banished. Because of that, the lovers needed to employ a complicated plan to be reunited. Because of that, communication broke down and an important message did not reach the son. Because of that, the son didn't realize his wife was only faking her death, and he thought she was really dead when he found her in the family tomb. Because of that, he killed himself. Until finally, the daughter awoke to find her husband dead beside her, and she plunged his knife into her body, just as the members of both families entered the tomb to find their beloved children dead. And ever since then, both families have stopped the nonsensical war between them and have learned to cooperate and live happily together. Of course, this is Shakespeare's story of Romeo and Juliet told through the story spine. Okay, now it's your turn to be an author. Use the story spine that I provided to write an original story. Try to be creative, but follow the story spine structure. I'll conclude the storytelling lecture by discussing some of the inherent problems with interactive stories and solutions to solve them. But first, how did your storytelling activity go? Did the spine help you in writing your story? Were you able to produce a pretty good story? Maybe not Shakespeare, but decent? The storytelling spine helps you with traditional storytelling. That is, it is a linear presentation of the events of the story puzzle. But games are interactive. Interactivity is about freedom, power, and self-expression. Remember, the designer story is the narrative of the game. It's the story the designer wants to tell the player. The player story is the story of the player's interactions and choices in the game. It may employ the designer story, but the game must be interactive. There must be that freedom and self-expression we just spoke of. Or the player will feel that they are not playing a game, rather just watching a movie. The gap between the designer story and the player story has created some common problems for interactive storytelling. The first is the problem of amnesia. The player has limited knowledge of the world at the outset of the game. Further, the player doesn't have great knowledge of what is to come in the story. This leads designers to need to create games with certain types of stories, such as amnesia, the player wakes up and doesn't know what's going on and needs to figure it out, or perhaps a rookie in a new situation. Maybe the player was a police officer and is promoted to be a detective and they have to, figure out how to be a detective and how to solve the case. Of course, mysteries follow this formula as well. Or the heroics quest, where someone leaves their ordinary, regular life and embarks on a big heroic quest, like we see in Lord of the Rings, for example. Another problem with interactive stories is the problem of internal consistency. That is, the stories and characters need to make sense in themselves. They need to be coherent to be a good story. But the player does not have to follow the rules of the story or the character. For example, the player may try to shoot an ally before they reveal an important clue, or a player may lose or not find a key that allows them to proceed in the story. Or maybe a player doesn't want to role-play their character in a massively multiplayer role-playing game. One of the solutions is to block the player from doing things, to limit their interactivity. But once again, this leads to a less than satisfying game at the expense of the story. The last problem that I'll discuss is the problem of narrative flow. As we saw in the story spine, good narrative flow has an introduction, rising action, a climax, and a resolution. But the problem is the player is in control. They may deviate from this path, causing an interruption in the flow. Some possible solutions are, once again, reduce the level of interactivity or make the interactivity just meaningless, or just advance the story if the player is ready or not to receive it, or have the story pause and wait for the player to be ready, once again interrupting the flow. None of these are great solutions. So what are some of the solutions that have been used in games? The first is the branching story, made popular by Choose Your Own Adventure books. The story is divided into a series of branching choices, where the player experiences part of the story and then has a choice point or branch. The branch leads to another part of the story. Some branches continue to branch out with additional choice points, and some branches die off with the end of the story. Branching stories allow the designer to build effective plots while giving the player choice. However, there are several problems with branching stories. The branching leads to a combinatorial explosion of possibilities. It's difficult enough to design one effective plot, let alone thousands. Further, it takes effort and cost to create a lot of content for a game that many players will not even experience. And while the player has choice, the choice still feels constrained. This low level of interactivity often doesn't lead to a very fun game. But the branching story technique is still used in dialogue systems of many games today. Another solution for interactive storytelling in games was inspired by the famous designer Roberta Williams at Sierra Online back in the 1980s on games such as King's Quest. The idea was to think of the story as a string of pearls. Each pearl is a story area that the player can freely explore. The string between the pearls represents the designer's plot constraint. That is, before moving from one pearl to the next of the story, the player must achieve something, like solving a puzzle, getting a key to open a door, or defeating a mini-boss. Thereby, the player feels that they have free will within the pearls, but there still is a linear story being told. This diagram depicts how the string of pearls is actually implemented in many games. As shown, there may be an intro cutscene that sets up or provides backstory on the upcoming section of the game, or pearl. Within the pearl, storytelling happens through gameplay, such as exploring the environment and interacting with NPCs. Between these segments of play, there may be cut sequences, which are in-game scripted actions that drive the story forward. They may be triggered animations, triggered dialogue, or brief periods where the camera is redirected to reveal something important to the player. Once the player completes the pearl, they are then rewarded with another cutscene that brings them to the next pearl. Overall, the string of pearls has become the common model of interactive storytelling used in action-adventure games. But while the story advances by the player's interactions, and the player has free will within the pearl, ultimately, the story itself is still just a linear or branching story. Another solution to interactive storytelling is the role-playing game model, where the game includes a lush, expansive, open game world for the player to explore. There is often an inherent element of character building, which gives the player choice in crafting their story. The player has choice in what to do, often is allowed to take on side quests that are not part of the main storyline, which further gives a sense of freedom and choice. The game mechanics themselves are often set up to give the player choice in how they proceed through the game. For example, if they prefer fighting, they can hack and slash through the game, or they can take a more magical approach to combat. This approach also adds some chance in outcome through the D&D style die roll and statistics, creating even more variety in outcome. What is interesting is that RPGs may employ branching for dialogue and even the string of pearls for the primary storyline arc of the game. But of course, there are limits to this approach as well. The last solution to interactive storytelling I'd like to present is that of the emergent story, as we see in games like The Sims or many construction management games. The game world is a simulated micro-world. There's often little designer story built in the game, but more of a focus on the behavior of the objects in the world. The player generates their own story through the interactions they have in the game, and through the interaction of the combination of objects and their behaviors. As a conclusion to this somewhat long-winded lecture, stories are important in most games to define the backstory and game setting. Character is often the most important component of storytelling, including games. There are several problems that must be considered when integrating stories, or at least plot, into games. There are several approaches that have been used to integrate stories into games and address some of these problems. Of course, we're just scratching the surface of exploring interactive storytelling, and there's still a lot of potential for innovation in this space. Perhaps one of you will create a new approach for interactive storytelling that will propel games forward. Welcome once again. In this lecture, we'll dive into the gameplay of the game. Ultimately, the gameplay is the most important aspect of your game. It literally is what makes a game a game. But what is a game? I realize that we have not yet defined what a game is. Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman, in their book Rules of Play, define a game as a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. A system is a set of things working together as part of a mechanism. Games have many parts that work together to create the resulting experience. Of course, games requires players to be engaged in them. And games are artificial conflict. We know we are in the safe space of the magic circle of the game, where our actions do not have consequences outside the game. If we die, for example, in a first-person shooter, we do not die in the real world. The game is a safe place to explore, experiment, and play. And the game is defined by rules. We're discussing gameplay today. Gameplay is created from the rules of the game. And the results are quantifiable. There often is a score or some metric of performance. The outcome is often a win, loss, or tie. Overall, I think this is a pretty good definition that highlights a lot of the things we need to define as game designers. Another good definition comes from Tracy Fullerton from her excellent book, Game Design Workshop. Tracy defines a game as a closed formal system that engages players in structured conflict and resolves its uncertainty in an unequal outcome. You can see there are several similar elements here from the last definition. We have the closed formal system of the game. Once again, the game is a system. It is closed, meaning it is outside the real world. It is the magic circle of the game, that artificial space that we spoke about. It is formal in that it is defined by rules. Once again, we have players engaged in it, and they are engaged in structured conflict. That is, the rules create the structure of the conflict. And there is uncertainty on the outcome of the game at the beginning of the game, but it is resolved in the end. The resolution is unequal, meaning there is often a winner or a loser. And a much less formal definition comes from Sid Meier, the legendary game designer of the Civilization series of games. He once defined games as a series of interesting choices. While this is not a very academic definition, it certainly points to what you need to do as game designers for your players. You need to give them interesting choices. There are many other definitions, but few help us design better games. This lecture is about diving deeply into games, decomposing the gameplay, and learning a process of design. Let's get started. Let's now look at the inner workings or the system of the game. That is, let's decompose gameplay. Let's start by looking at how games are different from other consumable media. On one side, we have the designer who creates the media. On the other, we have the consumer who consumes it. The media could be books, movies, television, or games. But how are games different from these other media forms? In a book, the author writes the book and the reader reads it. Every reader is reading the same book and getting the same story. They may interpret the story differently, and the story may impact them differently, but the story is fixed by the author. The same is true for a movie or television show. But with games, the consumer, or the player in this case, is an active part of the experience. The game itself is not fixed like other forms of media. Rather, it is dynamic and changes based on the player's interactions. Each player who plays the game will have a different experience. In fact, the same player who plays the game multiple times may have a very different experience each time they play with it based on how they interact with it. Here is an expanded model of consumption for games proposed by Marc LeBlanc. He created what he called the MDA framework, where he breaks the game down into three components: the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. This framework has become one of the standard frameworks used by the game industry when discussing games. And it is the basis of the expanded Design Play Experience framework that we've been using in this course. Let's talk about each of these components in more depth, starting with the aesthetics. In art, aesthetics are the principles concerned with the nature and the appreciation of beauty. It is defined by color, form, and shape. In games, Marc LeBlanc defined aesthetics as the principles concerned with the nature and the appreciation of fun. In both cases, aesthetics is emotional and subjective. As they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or perhaps, in the case of games, fun is in the mind of the player. But since aesthetics is an overloaded term used heavily to describe the visual experience of an art form, including games, I often substitute aesthetics for the word affect when talking about the MDA framework. Affect is a term from psychology meaning emotion or desire, especially as influencing behavior or action. I think this term is more clear when we are discussing gameplay, and we will reserve the word aesthetics for the artists. So this is our slight variation on the MDA framework. Minigames are fun. Settlers of Catan is fun. Halo is fun. And Mario Kart is fun. But are they fun in the same way? As game designers, we need to understand fun beyond a surface emotion. That is, we really need to decompose and understand fun to define the affective goals of our game. Many people have tried to decompose fun into more granularity. Pierre-Alexandre Garneau defined the forms of fun that you see here. For example, beauty is that which pleases the senses and may include graphics, music, sound effects, or touch. Competition is an activity where the goal is to show one's superiority, either over other players or against oneself, improving previous scores. Thrill of danger is fun where the stakes are high. Failure could lead to the player being killed, for example. Thrill of danger is what gets your blood pumping in that adrenaline rush. Overall, Garneau proposed 14 forms of fun. I included 2 additional forms of fun here that I did not think were completely captured by his 14, including altruism and learning. Hence, the 14 plus 2 forms of fun. I've included a handout that defines each of these forms of fun for your reference. I often find it useful to look over the list when I'm thinking about the effective goals for a game that I'm designing. That is, what forms of fun do I want my game to evoke in my players? As designers, we can choose certain effective goals for our game, but we need more than a one-word definition of our goal. Marc LeBlanc proposed using affective models, that is, having a rigorous definition of an effective goal. The models state the criteria for success and failure of the goal. It can be used as a design compass to know if you're reaching the goal in your design. For example, here's an effective model for the goal of competition. The model states a game is competitive if players are emotionally invested in defeating each other. We have success if the players are adversaries, that is, they're on competing sides, and the players want to win. Of course, if you've ever played a game and one of the players does not really care about the game and the other does, it's not, competition breaks down. So both players have to want to win the game. And we have failure if a player feels they cannot win, or if a player cannot measure their progress. So once again, if you're playing against, an older sibling and they're just so much better than you, they're always going to win. The element of competition breaks down. It's no longer, the competitive element is no longer fun. Further, you need to know how you're doing. You need to know your progress. If we have a racing game and you don't know what place you're in, you don't know where the other players are, competition breaks down, for example. If affect is emotional and subjective, we do not have direct control over them. So how do we meet our effective goals? We do so through the mechanics. Game mechanics are, of course, also known as the rules of play. As we've learned in our definitions today, all games have rules. Play without rules is just play. It's not a game. Overall, the game mechanics determine what choices a player will be able to make in the game world. We talked about these in our lecture on the game world, and what ramification those choices will have on the rest of the game. The game mechanics include defining the boundaries of the game world. In a non-digital game, you can think of this as the game board. The mechanics also include defining the game elements, the tokens, the pieces, and the game economy, or the resources in the game. And of course, all the other rules of play. That is, the choices, the challenges, and the player goals. One technique to think about when designing the mechanics of the game is to think of the mechanics as the actions you're allowing the player to take, or not take. In other words, what are the constraints on the actions of the player? For example, the player can run and jump on platforms and climb ladders, but they can't climb walls, and they die when they fall into lava. Some designers like to think of the mechanics as verbs of the game. That is, what can the player do? For example, the player can explore, build, craft, and fight in Minecraft, among other things. Of course, actions and verbs are just synonyms of each other. In the video that follows, Mark Brown discusses the secrets of Mario's jump and other versatile verbs as part of his Game Maker's Toolkit series. Please give it a watch for an in-depth analysis of game mechanics or verbs. We just finished our discussion of the mechanics and affect components of the MDA framework. Let's continue our discussion of the MDA framework and continue decomposing the elements of gameplay. At the onset of this lecture, we talked about how games are systems that play out over time. That is, games are dynamic. They are not just static rules, but they are the results of these rules over time. Said in another way, game mechanics lead to game dynamics as the game plays out. Shown here is a high-level state machine for a game. The diagram visualizes the player's input into the rules and how the rules lead to changes of state in the game, and how the change of state leads back into the rules. The outputs of the system are often the graphics and sound effects presented back to the player. We'll talk more about inputs and outputs in our next lecture, but for now, let's focus on everything within the dotted box. So the rules are the mechanics, but the entire state machine leads to the dynamics as the game plays out over time. So let's look back at the whole of the MDA framework. The mechanics are the rules and concepts that formally specify the game as a system. The dynamics are the runtime behavior of the game as a system, or the actual play. And the affect is the emotional responses evoked by the game dynamics, or the fun of the game. So how do specific dynamics emerge from specific mechanics? And how do specific dynamics evoke specific emotions? Here's one example. Perhaps dramatic tension is a desired emotion that we want to have in our game. Tension is something we often try to avoid in the real world, but in the artificial universe of the game, players often seek it out because we get the feeling of tension while being in the safety of the magic circle of the game. Tension without real-world consequences, if you will. Moving backward in the diagram to dynamics, time pressure is a dynamic that can create dramatic tension. If we feel we have limited time, we're going to start to feel tense. And there are various mechanics that could be designed into the game to create a time pressure dynamic, such as a time limit in a puzzle game, or a time bomb in an action-adventure that you have to get to and defuse before it goes off, or a pace car that you have to beat in a racing game to continue play, or even a depleting resource that you need to mine and use in a real-time strategy game. So once again, you should start by thinking of the effective goals first that you want your players to experience, and then design the mechanics that lead to the dynamics that create the affect. Of course, the modified MDA framework that we've been discussing forms the gameplay layer of the more encompassing design play experience framework we've been using throughout this course. Hopefully now you have a good understanding of the design, play, and experience elements of the gameplay. We'll use this framework in the design activity that follows. Our activity today will help us really understand how game mechanics lead to game dynamics and how the dynamics result in the player's emotional experience. To do this, I want you to pick a game that you know deeply. It can be any type of game, just make sure you know it in depth. Go ahead and pause the video and do this now. Start by using the Design Play Experience framework to decompose and analyze the design of your game. To do this, I literally would like you to draw a table on a piece of paper with storytelling, gameplay, and user experience rows, and design, play, and experience columns, as shown in the framework. Give yourself ample room within each box to add your notes, and then fill in the boxes related to your game. As you fill in each row of the table, try to line up the design, play, and experience elements that relate to each other. Pause the video now and take a few minutes to decompose and analyze your game using the Design Play Experience framework as a guide. Take a minute to look back at the Design Play Experience table that you just drafted. Can you see how the design elements of your game lead to the dynamic play state of the game, and how this play state led to the experience you walked away with when you played the game? How intentional do you think the designers were in the experience you had when you played the game? Do you think they really thought through the experiences they wanted you to have and then designed the game to achieve this? Take a moment and think about these questions. Okay, this is where the activity gets interesting. Now put yourself in the role of the design team for this game. Pretend the game is in a prototype state, but not yet done. You want to modify it before it's released to enhance it in some fashion. Look at the experience column of your table once again. Modify some aspect of the desired experience you want the players to have. For example, add an additional form of fun to the experience from the forms of fun list that I provided to you. Or perhaps try to remove a form of fun. Or modify the player's story you want the player to walk away with. The choice is up to you. Then look at the design column of your table. What would you need to do to the designer story or the mechanics of the game to support your new experience goals? Pause the video now and take a few minutes to document your thoughts on how you would modify the game. Okay, let's conclude with a few thought questions to think through related to the activity you just went through. What effective goals or player story goals did you have for the modified game? What changes did you make to the designer story, and how did you think this would affect the storytelling? And what changes did you make to the mechanics? How do you think this would lead to different dynamics? Do you think the resulting game improved or not, based on your modifications? I hope you took the time to work through this activity. I really think it helps you in taking the concepts we're discussing and putting them into practice. This will make you a more thoughtful and ultimately a better designer. I would like to conclude our discussion of gameplay by talking a bit about game genres. If you look up genre in the dictionary, it will say something like a category of artistic composition characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. It is interesting to note that film genres and game genres are very different. Film genres are based on how the film makes the audience feel, such as drama, comedy, romance, suspense thriller, and horror, or based on the setting of the film, such as fantasy, science fiction, war, western, etc. While game genres are based on the gameplay characteristics that the game employs, the feelings and setting do not matter in the classification of game genres. Wikipedia states, a first-person shooter is still a first-person shooter regardless of whether it takes place in a science fiction, fantasy, or military setting, so long as it features a camera mimicking the perspective of the protagonist and the gameplay centered around the use of ranged weaponry. I'm sure you're familiar with many game genres. Here are just a few with some of their defining gameplay characteristics. For example, the adventure genre typically includes a mixture of exploration, collection, and puzzle-solving gameplay, while real-time strategy games often include gameplay surrounding obtaining resources, building, researching technology, producing units, and conquest. Game genres can be further categorized into subgenres, each with their own gameplay characteristics. Here are some example genres and their respective subgenres. As games have evolved, we have seen an expansion in the types of gameplay, and hence, the number of genres and subgenres in games today has expanded. For a comprehensive list of game genres and subgenres, check out the Wikipedia article entitled List of Video Game Genres. Now let's talk a bit about the use of genres in designing games. Genres help you describe a game to your players. It gives them a way to understand what they will be doing in the game. It is also a tool used by the business side of the industry to understand what types of games are in demand and what genres are more attractive to certain categories of players. However, game genres should not be a template for the design of the game. That is, you should not start by thinking of a genre you want to make and then follow the mold of that genre. This often leads to stale games and a lack of innovation. As we've discussed, start first with the experience goals of your game. Think of what type of emotions or effective goals you want to tap into, and then work on the mechanics and dynamics that lead to these goals. Obviously, you can classify your game into a genre once it begins to take shape, but ideally, when designing a new game, don't start your design process thinking of the genre. And even if you do start with a genre, or are asked to create a game of a certain type of genre, as we do in this course, still follow the design play experience framework we discussed. This will lead to a more innovative and meaningful game versus a cookie-cutter clone of another game. So let's wrap things up with a quick summary of some of the key points I discussed in this lecture. Mechanics lead to dynamics. Dynamics lead to the emotional experience of the game or the affect. Gameplay and story influence the experience of the game. As a designer, Come up first with the goals for the experience, then design the mechanics to lead to these goals. Test if you're reaching your goals and iterate on the design if not. And genres and subgenres are used to classify games by gameplay characteristics. As I said up front, gameplay is what makes a game a game. It's a very important topic. To that end, we'll continue to discuss it in several upcoming lectures. Welcome back. Today's game design lecture will focus on the user experience of the game. The game designer Bruce Shelley once said, "The game designer's principal goal is to create entertaining gameplay. The purpose of the interface is to make that entertainment accessible." But what is a game's user experience? It is everything the user senses. That is, everything the player sees, hears, touches, smells, and tastes. It is also everything the player interacts with. This includes both the in-game interface and the control system. This diagram shows the relationship between the player, the user interface, and the gameplay. As you can see, the player creates inputs into the user interface. These become actions in the gameplay that results in challenges that are presented back through the user interface as outputs to the player, typically via the display or speakers. As we discuss the user experience, I think it's useful to keep this diagram in mind. Of course, the user experience is also represented in the design play experience framework we've been exploring. The overall game experience for the player is mediated by the user interface. That is, the gameplay and storytelling are communicated to the player through the UI. In this regard, the user experience is most affected by the technology layer the game is built upon. For example, I'm a big fan of board games, such as Settlers of Catan and Ticket to Ride. The user experience of the board game version of these games is very different than the user experience of the tablet or console version of these games, which, of course, are built on very different technology. But the storytelling and gameplay are essentially the same. In this lecture, we'll be doing another game design challenge. To help you ground the high-level concepts we are discussing related to user experience in the analysis of a game of your choice. To that end, like we have done in the past, I want you to pick a game that you know deeply. It can be any type of game. Just make sure you know it in depth. Go ahead and do this now. We will analyze the game's user experience across the following topics. Okay, let's now dive into the elements of the user experience, starting with the game inputs. When designing the input system, we need to look at both the game platform's hardware as well as the mode of interaction that utilizes the hardware. Let's talk about each of these in some depth. The standard personal computer input hardware, of course, is the keyboard and mouse, or various other mouse substitutes like the touchpad or the trackball. The standard PC keyboard has over 100 keys and is great for text entry. But most games today don't use text entry, so the keys are used to issue commands into the game, such as directional controls to the player character. Some games use the arrow keys for directional control, but keyboards vary in the layout of these arrow keys, so it's more standard for games to use the W, A, S, and D keys for directional control. This is typically referred to as WASD control. Of course, other keys can be used as well. For example, the spacebar is a large, easy-to-press key, so it's often mapped to something in the game that you do a lot, like jumping or shooting. Other keys can be mapped to game actions as well, but if you use too many keys, you run the risk of making the game hard to learn and turning off casual players. The mouse, when combined with an on-screen mouse pointer, is an excellent pointing device. This works great in games where you have to select many units on the screen, such as in a real-time strategy game like StarCraft, MOBAs like League of Legends, or construction management games like SimCity. But many first-person games utilize the mouse for camera control and the mouse buttons for shooting. While the keyboard and mouse are generic input devices that can be repurposed for games, game consoles come with input hardware specifically designed for games. The original Nintendo Entertainment System pioneered the game controller. The early controllers were very simple, offering directional control, 2 action buttons, A and B, and a couple system buttons, select and start. This led to simple, easy-to-learn gameplay. However, the controllers have gotten a lot more sophisticated over the years, adding many more forms of input that, among other things, have led to much more deep forms of input, which tailors more to the core game player. But these forms of input are better for games where you're controlling a player character directly, such as a first-person or third-person game. They are less good at games that require precise selection of units on the screen or buttons in a complex menu. The mouse on the PC still reigns supreme for this task. Mobile devices have popularized the touchscreen, which is also great at precise selection of elements on the screen through the very natural action of pointing and touching. The mobile hardware goes farther by adding other sensors for tracking motion using accelerometers, gyroscopes, and even microphones, cameras, and GPS. Of course, many consoles now also employ similar sensors on their game controllers or via optional add-ons such as the Xbox Kinect or PlayStation Move. Virtual reality and augmented reality systems take the next leap forward in input hardware, creating new, more natural forms of input into games. And of course, there's a huge list of other controllers out there that have been used across the history of gaming, from the joystick to the steering wheel to the gun, dance pads, and guitars. These forms of input hardware are more prominent in the arcade, where the experience can be tailored for each game. They are often an optional additional purchase for games played in the home. Therefore, from a business perspective, you either have to support more standard forms of input in addition to these custom controllers, or you severely limit the size of the audience for your game. The input hardware is how the player speaks into the game. The interaction model is how this input translates into actions in the game. Said another way, it is the mapping between the player's input and the game mechanics. There are several types of interaction models that you can design into your game, such as avatar-based interaction, where the player is controlling an avatar directly, or multi-present interaction, where the player can act upon several different parts of the game world at one time, or party-based interaction, where the player controls a small group or party of characters at one time. You can think of the interaction model as the language of interaction. You have the methods of communicating, that is, what physical actions does the player take to communicate with the game, and you have the language of interaction, that is, how does the player form commands. For example, the language of interaction could be the player selects a verb, such as attack, represented by a sword, then selects the noun, such as a dragon, representing who they want to attack. Verb, then noun interaction. Or perhaps they select the noun first, the dragon, and then select the verb, the sword, which would be noun and then verb interaction. Remember, you're designing the language the player will speak to the game. The player needs to learn how they control the movement of their avatar, how they control the camera or aim their weapons, how they attack, how they defend, how they bring up and manage their inventory, how they interact with friendly NPCs and engage them in dialogue, or buy and sell items at a shop, or even how they ride a horse. All this can be daunting for you to design and for the player to learn. It's important to understand what games are popular on a given game platform within your game genre, and if any input standards have emerged. For example, if you're designing a first-person shooter on Xbox, how do players typically control the avatar? How do they typically control the camera? What buttons should be mapped to shooting, jumping, and so on? There are likely standards for this. Take a moment and think about what are the standard inputs for each genre listed by game platform, such as the personal computer, a game console, such as the Xbox or PlayStation, or a mobile device, such as an iPad. Feel free to pause the video, think about this, and possibly even fill out a table like the one shown. Once again, you should standardize where it makes sense, and innovate where innovation is needed. For example, when a new console comes out with a new input device, you may need to innovate because the standard has not yet emerged. We saw this when the Wii motion controller first came out, and then again when mobile devices like the iPhone became popular, and then again when commercial VR systems such as the Oculus and Vive were released, and so on. it often takes some innovation before a standard emerges. It is said that game interfaces are evolutionary, not revolutionary. Good interfaces propagate forward, while bad ones die with their titles. So there is a bit of survival of the fittest principle in game interfaces. You should build on the successes of others whenever possible. And of course, give the player options. Let them customize their controls so they can fine-tune the interactions to their needs. A good example of this is the invert y-axis customization that many games employ. There are some players that highly prefer the inverted model, as shown on the left, while others highly prefer the non-inverted model, shown on the right. Why alienate players? Offer both modes of interaction. Let the player choose. The input system is often thought through and communicated to the development team using a control table, like the one shown here. Basically, a control table shows the mapping of input to game mechanics or actions in different states of gameplay. So as part of your design activity, take the game that you've chosen up front and document the inputs in your game based on whatever game platform that you played the game upon. For example, you can create a control table to show the inputs that map to different actions based on the state of the game. Pause the video now to do this. One challenge for game designers is to take a control table for one game platform and then translate it or port it to another game platform. For example, if your game is a console game, you may need to port it to a mobile device. How would the inputs change? I've heard this is a favorite design test question during the hiring process at some game studios for user experience designers. In the video that follows, Mark Brown discusses how controllers control everything as part of his Game Maker's Toolkit series. Please give it a watch for an in-depth analysis of game controllers and how they interface into the game. Let's continue our discussion of the user experience by looking at the game output system. The goal of the output system is to communicate or provide feedback to the player. The communication needs to be easy to understand and efficient, given the often high-speed pacing of games, and ideally aesthetically pleasing to the player. The communication methods include visuals, audio, possibly tactile feedback, and less often through other forms. Today we'll focus on the visuals, since that is the primary output system in today's video games. We'll cover audio in another lecture. When designing the visuals of the output system, the first principle is to make things visual. Games are a visual medium. Like I said, that often is your primary form of communication with the player. Most people think quicker when they see things visually represented through things like iconography, progress bars, and the like, versus displaying information in textual form, where the player needs to read it. In general, limit text as much as possible. Use it only when non-real-time interactions are required, such as during dialogue, when the action of the game is essentially paused. And of course, you can use voice acting to further minimize a reliance on text. When it comes to visuals, follow the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. When designing your interface, less is usually more. Angry Birds is a great example of this with very minimal UI. The screen is primarily focused on representing the game world. There is just a single pause button and a score indicator. Once pause is pressed, a menu slides in with additional options. But even these are minimal and just the most common things needed, such as restarting the level, continuing play, going back to the main menu, adjusting the volume, and getting additional help. This simplicity is particularly needed when designing for a casual gaming audience. Of course, when you're designing the visuals of your interface, keep asking, is there a way you can simplify the interface? Is a button or screen element really needed? Does it need to be on the screen at all times? Definitely the trend today is to minimize the heads-up display during gameplay and focus the player on being immersed within the game world. When designing the interface, you should follow good visual design principles. There are 4 simple principles that you can follow. They are contrast, make different things different. Repetition, be consistent across your design. Things like font choices, color choices, and the size and placement of visual elements should be consistent across screens, levels, and the like. Alignment. You want to align elements with each other. Left, right, or center align vertical stacks of visual elements. Top, bottom, or middle align horizontal stacks of visual elements. And use proximity. This is the antithesis of the principle of contrast. That is, put like things together visually. These 4 principles are simple to remember and follow, even for non-designers. The acronym that the 4 principles make is CRAP, or CRAP. The saying goes, if you don't design with the CRAP principles, your design looks like crap. Game screens are often categorized as menu screens and in-game screens. The menu screens are all the user interface that is outside the actual gameplay. This includes things like the main menu, character select screens or avatar builder screens, level select screens, and game setting screens. When designing a game, it's important to think about what menus your game needs, and think about the flow between the menus, as well as the visual design of each menu. In-game screens are where your player will live most of the time when playing your game. In-game screens are usually broken into the view on the game world and the heads-up display elements, or the HUD. Common HUD elements include indicators of performance, such as score or high score, indicators of progress or status, such as a level indicator, lives remaining, or health, or your location on a minimap and the player's current goals or objectives, and context-specific things such as stats or controls for a selected object. Like I said, the trend today is to minimize the HUD and focus most of the real estate of the display on representing the game world. So how do we go about designing the visuals of the user interface? This diagram from Jesse James Garrett's book, The Elements of User Experience, discusses interface design of websites, but this also can apply to games. In design, it's often best to move from the abstract to the concrete. We often want to start with the strategy. What is the experience we want our players to have? And then move on to the scope or features we need in the interface. After that, we can give the scope structure by creating flowcharts. We can then start to design the layout of the screens by creating wireframes or rough mock-ups of the screen. Finally, we can bring everything together by creating the surface representation of the screen through visual concepts or actual production art. Okay, for the next step in your design activity, take the game that you chose up front and document the output in your game. Think about the game menus and the flow between the game menus. You can draw a flowchart similar to the one shown. Also think about the design of the in-game screens, including the view on the game world and the heads-up display. You can draw an actual wireframe of the screen, similar to the one shown. Pause the video now and do this. When thinking about games' inputs and outputs, there are 2 extremely important elements of most games that bears mentioning here. They are the character controller and the game camera. The character controller is how the inputs are mapped to the actions in the game, particularly games that have a first-person or third-person player representation. The game camera is the view on the game world that allows the players to visualize the challenges that they are facing. The game camera may, at least partially, be controlled by the player. Much of the user experience work of both design and programming on many game projects centers around implementing and perfecting the character controller and the game camera. These 2 elements should not be underestimated in time and complexity. Many games fall short due to deficiencies in one or both of these. In the 2 videos that follow, Mark Brown discusses these 2 elements in the mechanics of movement and the challenge of cameras as part of his Game Maker's Toolkit series. Please give both of them a watch for an in-depth analysis of character control and game cameras. In the final segment of this lecture, we'll discuss the overall design of the game's user experience. The game designer Ernest Adams once said, "Today's gamers call out for a high degree of sophistication and complexity, but paradoxically, they want it simpler and easier to use than ever before." Often the goal of the user experience is to be as transparent as possible. You want your player to be thinking about what they are doing, not about how they're doing it. Said another way, you want the challenge to be in the game, not in the controls. In the book, The Art of Interaction Design, game designer Chris Crawford argues that for communication to take place between two people, each person needs to speak, listen, and think. As I mentioned, when designing the user experience for a game, we really are designing the communication between the player and the game. As Chris Crawford said, in order for communication to happen, both parties need to speak, listen, and think. With games, one of the parties is software, not another human being. But it still needs to speak through its outputs, listen through its inputs, and think through the rules of the game and the game code. Therefore, when we're designing the game, we need to empathize with the player and design the game in a fashion that the player can quickly learn how to communicate with the game. One way to empathize with the player is to understand the player. One tool for understanding players is called persona analysis. Persona analysis is a way to get to know the player and explore their needs and motivations so we can more effectively design the user experience of the game. Personas are fictional characters which you create based upon your research of the target audience for your game. Creating personas will help you understand your players while you design your game. It grounds your design decisions in your target audience while giving a specific personality to the target audience. In that sense, you're designing to meet the needs of an individual rather than a large generic group. As an example, here are two personas for the Madden football game. The primary persona is Zach. He's a 21-year-old male, college student studying advertising. He likes watching college and pro football. He spends a lot of time playing Xbox with his friends. He is a core gamer. The secondary persona is Bill. He's a 45-year-old male. He is a businessman and father of two teenage boys. He likes playing games with his boys, but also occasionally stays up late to play games with his friends online via his PlayStation. He is a former high school football player and a big fan of the NFL. The demands on his life has made him more of a casual game player. Armed with these two personas, the design team of the next Madden game can make decisions on what features to include or change based on Zach and Bill, not a generic target audience. What would Zach feel about this feature? Would this appeal also to Bill? This sort of discussion puts a name and face on design decisions about potential players. For the next step in the design activity, create a primary and secondary persona of the typical player of your game. You can include things like demographic information, such as age and gender, player type information, most notably, are they a casual or core player type? You can also personalize the personas with some information to make them realistic. Create a bio for them. What is their occupation? What are their interests or hobbies? What are their likes and dislikes? And finally, give each persona a name so you can refer to them. Pause the video now to complete this activity. For the final step of the design activity, look back over your notes on the input and output of your game's user experience. Also look at the personas that you've just produced. Does the input and output systems in the game fit the personas? If not, how can the input and output systems be enhanced to better align with the primary and secondary personas so they have a better user experience? Finally, do you think this persona analysis technique would be helpful in the game design process, particularly as it relates to enhancing the game's user experience? I started this user experience lecture with a quote that said the purpose of the user interface was to make the game accessible to your player. Unfortunately, games tend to be one of the least accessible software interfaces. When designing the user experience of a game, you should consider how your choices affect accessibility to the audiences shown here, and if there are ways to add features to expand the accessibility to a wider audience. Mark Brown put together a great series of videos on making games more accessible. There is one on making games better for the deaf and hard of hearing, one for making games better for color blindness and low vision, one for making games better for players with motor disabilities, and one for making games better for players with cognitive disabilities. He also has a few case studies that look at specific games. In any case, I don't expect you to watch all of them, but I've included a link to the series of videos. If you're interested, please check out one or more of them, and definitely consider how to make your game's user experience as accessible as possible. In this lecture, I'll dive deeper into the topic of game technology. Games have been an integral part of the human existence since very ancient times. One of the earliest games in recorded history is Mancala, a game coming out of Africa. This game was originally played with rocks and depressions in the dirt, what you might consider very rudimentary game technology. Of course, today you can play Mancala on your iPad or computer. Some say that Go has been played for over 4,000 years in the East, and chess has been played for over 2,000 years in the West. Games have been used in society across time to help prepare us for war. And games have been used as celebrations of peace and athleticism, with the earliest Olympic Games dating back to 776 BC. Games have been used as rallying points for communities, from colleges to cities, states, and countries. Go green! Of course, today we're talking more about this type of game, games that are played with the assistance of computing devices. That is, games built upon digital game technology. In the Design Play Experience framework that we've been using throughout this course, we've discussed how the storytelling, gameplay, and user experience layers all rest upon the technology layer. Technology is an enabler and an influencer of the games that we can build. In fact, there's a tight integration between games and computing technology. That is, technology advances drive games forward, while games push our technology to the limit and drives the industry to advance the technology. Of course, games also drive consumers to upgrade their computing devices so that they can play the latest games. In the videos that follow, I'll continue to discuss this tight integration between games and game technology. As we go, I'll propose a few game design challenges along the way, all related to game technology. Let's get started. Understanding a bit about the history of game technology helps us understand today's game technology. It also helps us understand why things are the way they are in the industry today by learning the backstory of current industry heavyweights, as well as the origin of some of our game mechanics and game franchises. So let's dive into a brief history of game technology. Stored program digital computers were developed during World War II in the early 1940s, primarily as a way to do complex math calculations, such as to calculate artillery fire and crack encryption codes. The first commercial computer systems became popular in the 1950s. These were very expensive, very large computers, often taking up entire rooms and sometimes entire buildings. At this time, there was no real display or input-output system other than physical switches and buttons on the computers and punch cards that you would create and feed into the computers, resulting typically in a set of lights turning on or off, or later, a printout of paper. One of the earliest video games was created in 1958 by a nuclear physicist named William Higginbotham. It was a completely hardware circuit-based game called Tennis for Two. It was played using two separate controllers connected to an analog computer and using an oscilloscope as a screen. The game was developed over a short period of time to create an interactive display at a public exhibition for the Brookhaven National Laboratory. It was essentially just a tech demo. Given the expense of these early computers, in the 1960s, the first time-shared operating systems were developed. This allowed multiple people to share in the use of the computer. They could each connect to the computer using a terminal, which typically was a CRT display and keyboard. Some high-level programming languages were introduced at this time, like Fortran and BASIC, to make it easier to write programs for these computers. While the purpose of the computer was purely business, military, or academic research, some of the engineers that had access to the mainframe systems started to tinker with them and develop games. Many people point to Space War as one of the most influential early computer games. Space War was created in the early 1960s at MIT by Steve Russell on the PDP-1 mainframe computer. Unlike Tennis for Two, Space War was programmed in software that ran on top of the computer. It was a simple two-player spaceship shooter game where players engaged in a dogfight while navigating around a gravity well of a star in the middle of the circular screen. The game was used to demonstrate the capabilities of this new computer. In 1971, Intel released the first commercially available central processing unit, or CPU. The silicon-based chip was able to reduce 2,250 transistors down into a form factor the size of a matchbox. Therefore, this was dubbed a microprocessor. It was inexpensive and could be manufactured in large quantities. As a result, it increased a computer's power while greatly shrinking the size of the computers. Overall, the silicon chip greatly changed computing and society forever. In 1972, Atari created a table tennis-themed arcade game called Pong. Many point to Pong as the first arcade video game. The mid-1970s through the early 1980s signified the rise of the video game arcade. Many classic arcade game play experiences were defined and several game franchises were born, from Breakout and Space Invaders to Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. At this time, if you wanted to play the best games, you went to the arcade because that is where the action was at. Also in the early 1970s, just as the color television was being installed in households across North America, the company Magnavox created the Odyssey that allowed you to play games from home by hooking it up to a television. The Odyssey came with 28 games, each designed into a printed circuit board. The graphics were very primitive, but it came with plastic transparencies that you could overlay on your television screen to theme the game to different settings. The most popular of the games was a ping pong game, which was actually the inspiration for Atari's Pong arcade game. But the popularity of Pong in the arcade actually helped drive sales of the Odyssey, as people wanted to play Pong at home. Many people point to the Magnavox Odyssey as the first home game console. In 1977, Atari released the Atari Video Computer System, which was later rebranded as the Atari 2600. Prior to this, most of the game systems had the games built in the hardware, or, like the Odyssey, shipped the games on printed circuit boards. But the Atari 2600 was a microprocessor-based computer system, and the games were software that shipped on external read-only memory cartridges. This led to a boom in the market of making and selling games, separate from the hardware. Suddenly, there were companies like Activision springing up whose sole business was making and selling games, not game hardware. As the industry grew, so did the competition, both in the hardware space of game console systems and in the software space of game titles. Unfortunately, in 1983, there was a large-scale recession in the video game industry. The crash was attributed to several factors, including market saturation in the number of game consoles and the sheer number of available games, many of which were disappointing in quality. At this time, the consumer market was also turning their attention to personal computers over game consoles. The game industry did not really recover until Nintendo released the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, in North America at the end of 1985 and across 1986. The NES was essentially a revised version of the 1983 Famicom, released in Japan. Nintendo tried to mitigate the issues that caused the recession. To get your game on the NES, you had to be licensed and approved by Nintendo, and they had high quality standards and limited the number of releases so as to not flood the market. Of course, there is now a long history of game console systems. The 1970s were dominated by Magnavox and Atari, and the 1980s by Nintendo and Sega. Nintendo helped define the handheld gaming system in 1989 with the release of the original Game Boy. The 1990s showed additional growth for Nintendo with the release of the Super NES in 1991 and then the Nintendo 64 in 1996, as well as the Game Boy Color in 1998. Sony entered the game console market in 1995 with the release of the Sony PlayStation, and Atari and Sega tried to compete during this time, but ultimately exited the hardware side of the game industry by the early 2000s. In 2001, Microsoft jumped into the game industry with the big launch of the Xbox, competing with the release of the Sony PlayStation 2 and the Nintendo GameCube. Since the early 2000s, the three dominant companies in the home console space have been Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. These three have been releasing their next major platform updates, typically on a 5 to 7 year cycle, with the Microsoft Xbox 360 in 2005 and the Sony PlayStation 3 and Nintendo Wii both in 2006. Then the Nintendo Wii U in 2012 and the Sony PlayStation 4 and Microsoft Xbox One in 2013. The most recent consoles as of this recording is the Nintendo Switch, released in 2017, and the Microsoft Xbox Series X and Sony PlayStation 5, released in 2020. Of course, many other console systems from many other companies have come and gone. This table shows just a few of the biggest consoles, sorted into generations. The consoles are listed in order of units sold, with the highest number being listed first. We are currently in the 9th generation of game consoles. It will be interesting to see what the future holds. Of the three major game console companies, Microsoft and Sony have tended to compete head-to-head, both catering to the more core gamer market, really pushing the cinematic quality of AAA gaming while also billing their console as complete entertainment systems, extending beyond games. While Nintendo has focused more on casual gamers and billing their console as a gaming system for the whole family, focusing on gameplay fun over cinematic quality, as well as their unique IPs, such as Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon. The Switch is also interesting because it bridges between a home console and a handheld gaming system. It basically replaces both the Wii U and the Game Boy. It'll be interesting to see if Nintendo continues in this path. In the latest generation, Microsoft and Sony are taking a different tact of allowing you to remote play console games on your mobile devices, such as tablets or phones. Let's continue our brief history of game technology. Running parallel to the game console systems is the personal computer. Many point to the release of the Apple I in 1976 and the Apple II in 1977 as the birth of the personal computer. Apple focused on the home, hobbyist, and education market, while IBM focused on the small office and home office with the release of the IBM PC in 1981. The early personal computers had very little memory, primitive graphics and sound, primitive storage in the form of a cassette tape drive, and later the floppy disk drive, and eventually the hard drive. The early PCs ran what was called a disk operating system, or DOS. The original DOS for the IBM PC was created by Microsoft, which was their first foray into developing operating systems. The 1984 release of the Apple Macintosh popularized the graphical user interface and the mouse, and was dubbed as the computer for the rest of us. Microsoft later copied many of the elements of the Mac OS in the development of their own graphical operating system that they called Windows. While most of the game companies were focused on the arcade and home consoles at this time, games on the personal computer really started from more the hobbyist culture. Small teams made games in BASIC or assembly, initially just to share them and show off what they could do. Over time, the games advanced in quality and were packaged up and sold in stores. Sierra Online, Origin, Surtec, Broderbund, Microprose, and Electronic Arts were early PC game companies that helped define the PC game market. Of course, Electronic Arts has persevered and grown into one of the largest game publishers today. Just like the console wars, there has been a similar battle in the marketplace across the years, with many PC platforms coming and going. Today, the primary PC platforms are Windows, Macintosh, various flavors of Unix, such as Linux, and Chrome OS. We can also view the web itself as its own platform, running within the browser of the personal computer. The history of mobile devices is also a long and storied one. From a technology standpoint, mobile devices are a convergence of many other technologies, from the personal computer to the telephone to the camera to the clock to the GPS to handheld games and beyond. Personally, I view the introduction of the iPhone in 2007 as one of the biggest milestones in this technology convergence. For the first time, we had a singular mobile device that could do all these different things, including playing games. And mobile games have had a profound amount of growth since the launch of the iPhone. In fact, mobile game sales made up nearly 50% of total game revenues in 2020. Today, in the mobile game space, there are two primary platforms or operating systems that you target. iOS on Apple devices, including the iPhone, iPad, iPod, Apple TV, and Apple Watch, and the Android operating system. This diagram, adapted from Ernest Adams' Breaking into the Game Industry book, shows how various gaming platforms have emerged over time. The diagram depicts a break between PC gaming and arcade gaming platforms back in the 1970s, and the subsequent diversification of platforms, with web and VR games coming out of the PC games, and the home console and handheld games spawning out from the arcade games, amongst others such as gambling machines and location-based entertainment. Once again, mobile games are shown as a convergence between PC games and handheld games. Today, however, while there are more and more platforms to play games on, I think there is actually a convergence when it comes to game technology. That is, the dividing lines between platforms is becoming a bit less clear when it comes to the underlying game technology. And it is easier than ever to develop a game for one platform and then move it to a new platform. As we look at the past and consider the future, the one thing that we know will be constant in terms of game technology is change. As a game design challenge, pause the video and take a few moments to think through your game history. What was the first game you remember playing? And what platform was it on? What is the most recent game you played? What was the platform? Now create a timeline from first to latest. Try to mark milestone dates where you got or at least played on a new platform, as well as list a few of the games you remember playing on that platform. Pause the video now and do this. In the next video, we'll discuss modern game technology concepts, starting with hardware. Discussing the innermost workings of the computer hardware is beyond the scope of this class. You will find such information in a computer architecture course. However, I do think it's important to understand a few key components and what they do. So let's continue our discussion by talking a bit about game technology hardware. Within your computing device, be it a personal computer, home console, or mobile device, it will have these components. A motherboard, sometimes referred to as a logic board, which connects all of the hardware components. A power supply to power everything and possibly cool it. A central processing unit, or CPU. Random access memory modules for the computer's working memory while executing a program. Storage devices in the form of a hard disk drive or solid-state drive for persistent memory to store programs and data. A graphics processing unit or external graphics card for processing graphics and interfacing with a display. An audio processing unit or external audio card. A network processing unit or external network card for connecting to the network. And any number of external ports for interfacing the device to external inputs and outputs, like keyboards, displays, and the like. Let's talk about a few of these components in more depth. The CPU, or central processing unit, resides in almost any computing device, from your game console to your personal computer to your smartphone. The CPU is responsible for processing and executing instructions. It is basically the digital brains of your device. It works with other components of the hardware, such as memory, input, output, and storage, to make the computer work. Modern CPUs are composed of billions of small transistors that together run the software instructions. Over time, we've been able to pack more and more transistors in smaller and smaller spaces. This has improved the speed of CPUs over the decades. Moore's law is the observation that the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit doubles every 2 years. Or said another way, computer processing power doubles roughly every 2 years. More computing power means more performance, which means more complex games are possible. This can include complexity in gameplay logic, physics, artificial intelligence, inputs and outputs, among other things. Originally, CPUs had a single processing core. Today's modern CPUs consist of multiple cores that allow you to perform multiple instructions at once, effectively cramming several CPUs on a single chip. Another important metric is how many instructions the CPU can process per second. On modern CPUs, this is often measured in gigahertz, or billions of instructions per second. We call this the clock speed of the CPU. And there is the amount of memory that the CPU can reference, and the amount of data that the CPU can process at once. This is often measured in bits of information, with the earliest CPUs only processing 4 bits at a time. Over time, as CPUs advanced, then 8 bits, 16 bits, 32 bits, and most processors today work at 64 bits. And finally, cache memory is ultra-high-speed memory that typically sits within the CPU itself and provides faster access to data. Overall, the more cores, the faster the clock speed, the larger the bus, and the more cache, typically the more powerful the processor. But the CPU is not the entire picture of a computer's performance. The CPU works in conjunction with the random access memory, or RAM, which holds the programs and data that are currently being executed by the computer. The RAM is often referred to as system or working memory of the computer, and typically is much larger and less expensive than cache memory. Overall, the amount and the speed of the RAM has a huge impact on the computer's performance. With games, it's not just about performance in general, but also graphics performance. Games have required faster and faster graphics performance over the years to drive more and more pixels, as well as more computational power when making the transition from 2D graphics to 3D graphics. In the mid-1990s, processing of graphics on high-end computers was moved off the CPU and into a dedicated graphics processing unit, or GPU, typically with its own high-speed memory separate from the computer's RAM. At this time, the GPU was typically in the form of a plug-in card from 3dfx and later NVIDIA and ATI. The dedicated GPU allowed for real-time rendering of graphics. Rudimentary at first, but as the technology advanced, we were able to design more and more realistic games. In modern computers, the GPU is sometimes integrated into the CPU, which is called integrated graphics. Or, as just discussed, the GPU is on a separate chipset, often in the form of an expansion graphics card, such as the NVIDIA GeForce series. The separate GPU is called dedicated or discrete graphics. Dedicated GPUs are often used for the most high-performance graphics applications, such as virtual reality. Most computer devices today come with an integrated audio chip on the motherboard to process the audio needs. However, just like the case in graphics, you sometimes may want to add a dedicated audio expansion card or external USB sound card if your audio needs surpass the integrated audio. Let me talk briefly about a recent trend in chip design called System on a Chip, or SoC. A system on a chip is an integrated circuit that combines all or most components of a computer or electronic system into a single chip. These components almost always include a central processing unit, GPU, memory, and input and output port controllers. This was first done in mobile devices, such as smartphones, and Internet of Things devices, such as those built around the Raspberry Pi. Today, SoC is now also being used in game consoles and personal computers. Let's continue our discussion of game technology hardware. Let's talk a bit about storage. The computer can access cache and RAM the fastest, but this type of memory is what is called volatile memory. When we turn off the power, all the data is lost. Between executions, the programs and data need to be stored someplace that is non-volatile or persistent, meaning that it continues to exist even when the power is turned off. Further, we need some way to distribute our games. For both of these purposes, the computer needs some sort of storage device. Early game systems like the Odyssey had integrated circuitry that was non-changeable. That is, everything that shipped with the hardware is what you got. There was no saving of game state, no new games, no game updates. The instructions were built into the hardware. Read-only memory is a way to store computer programs or data on a chip. The information persists even when the power is off. Therefore, ROM often stores things like the computer's firmware, which often includes the initial instructions on how to boot up when you first power the computer on. Like the name implies, this sort of memory is read-only, meaning you cannot save data to it. However, modern ROM chips are often reprogrammable, so you can do firmware updates, for example. As discussed with the Atari 2600, early game consoles shipped their games on cartridges. These cartridges were literally a pluggable ROM chip that you could buy at the store to add games to your console. Since they were ROMs, you could not update the games once it was written to the cartridge and shipped, so any bugs that shipped with the game were there forever. Early personal computers often had cassette or floppy disk drives where you could read and write data to a magnetic medium. This often had limited storage, which meant you had to constantly change disks or even flip them over to access the other side. Games at this time would ship on several disks. The disks were relatively easy to copy, which led to the rise of piracy in the game industry. The CD-ROM was a popular form of storage in the 1990s. It contained 650 megabytes of read-only space. They were cheap to manufacture and easy to distribute, and could be encrypted to help prevent piracy. All of this additional storage meant that game developers could fit a lot more graphics and audio content in their games. The original PlayStation shipped with the CD drive. The CD evolved into the DVD in the early 2000s, which typically held 4.7 gigabytes of space, or more than 6 CDs worth of content. The PlayStation 2 and Xbox shipped with a DVD drive. After the DVD came the Blu-ray discs, which held at least 25 gigabytes of space, or 5 DVDs worth on a single disc. The PlayStation 3, 4, and 5, as well as the Xbox One and Xbox Series X, all shipped with a Blu-ray drive. One interesting thing is the form factor of the CD, DVD, and Blu-ray all remained consistent. The Secure Digital Card, or SD card, is a proprietary non-volatile memory card that was originally developed as a storage device for mobile devices and cameras. It has evolved over the years, growing in storage capacity while reducing in physical size. The SD card can be read-write or can be set to be read-only. The Nintendo Switch uses a micro SD card for its game cards, sold at retail. Personal computers and consoles typically include a larger capacity storage device in the form of a hard disk or solid-state drive. The trend has been to move from the magnetic-based hard drive to the faster and more reliable solid-state drive during recent years as the price of SSDs become more competitive. And last but certainly not least, using a network-based server or cloud of servers on the internet as a form of persistent storage has also become a popular approach. The amount of storage can be virtually limitless. The main barrier is the speed of the internet connection. Overall, most game platforms typically use a combination of storage devices and approaches. Let me conclude my discussion of game technology hardware by mentioning that there is often a difference between development hardware and playback hardware. We often develop our games on high-end personal computers with a fast CPU, lots of memory, a high-end GPU, possibly a dedicated audio card, lots of storage, and a large and perhaps multiple displays. Since we are working in many applications, building and testing games for a majority of the day, we often can rationalize spending more for all the bells and whistles. But our players may not have the luxury. You need to make sure you test your games on a variety of hardware configurations, particularly if you're targeting the PC market, where our players' hardware specs can be all across the board, from 8-year-old low-end hardware to the latest greatest souped-up gaming PCs. Also realize that for certain platforms, you may be developing on a high-end PC, but your target may be a mobile or game console. For mobile development, you often can simulate the device on the PC in something like the Unity Device Simulator, but you really need to build and deploy to the actual target hardware for more accurate testing. And once you're ready to deploy your game to your players, you often need to submit the game to the distribution channel owner, such as Apple or Google, for certification and signing, for external beta testing, and ultimately for distribution. And when developing for console, you often must have what is called a dev kit that you purchase from the platform owner, such as Nintendo, Microsoft, or Sony. You usually still develop on a PC, but then you build and deploy to the dev kit for testing. The dev kit is often a modified version of the consumer console, sometimes with additional features for debugging. It generally is not possible to build and deploy to a consumer console directly. You must use a dev kit. Once you're ready to deploy the game to the consumers, you must go through the platform manufacturer to get your game certified and signed for playback on consumer devices. Take a moment to think about your ultimate game development workstation. Pause the video and fill in this table, including the platform, specs on the CPU, GPU, RAM, and storage. Also think about the displays, as well as other hardware you would like to include. You can also think about brand and ultimately cost. Pause the video now to do this. Here are the recommendations I give my students at Michigan State University when they ask what to buy as a student in our game major. These are just suggestions, not requirements, as you can make games on almost any level of hardware. But of course, the hardware is only half the equation. The other half is software, and that is the topic of our next video. Let's continue our discussion of game technology by discussing a bit about the software side of game technology. At the deepest level, computers work on ones and zeros or on and off. Early computer programming involves setting physical switches to make the computer do things. Then we expedited this by using punched cards that we fed into the computers, as previously discussed. But this was slow and painful. Machine language, or machine code, is a way of representing the native binary language of the computer as a set of atomic instructions that are executed by the CPU. At this level, most of the instructions are just moving bits of information around or jumping from one set of instructions to another. Programming in machine code is sometimes called writing directly to the metal. While back in the early PC days, people did write machine code, as shown here, but because of the tediousness of doing this, it is rarely done anymore, except for situations that require the most extreme optimization. A much more readable rendition of machine language, called assembly language, uses mnemonic codes to refer to machine code instructions, rather than using the instructions' numerical values directly. But this still is not very human readable. This is generally as close to the metal that any computer scientist ever gets. Fortunately, most of us don't need to dive this deep. High-level languages are abstracted from the details of the computing hardware and made to be more human readable and writable. The language is then compiled or interpreted into assembly or directly to machine language. There are literally hundreds of high-level computer languages in existence. Some high-level languages are more efficient than others. That is, they compile down to more efficient machine code. Some are easier to read and write for humans. And some languages are great at solving certain types of problems, like accounting tasks, processing text data, or creating games. The C variant of languages have been and continue to be what most game developers use for commercial game projects. These languages are used to create not only games, but also game engines. However, sometimes an easier to use programming language, sometimes called a scripting language, is used on top of a game engine to actually create the game logic. Using a higher level language makes it easier for non-programmers to program. Some scripting languages are visual in nature, meaning that rather than type out code, you program by creating visual diagrams made up of nodes and connections that usually represent the flow of game logic and data in the game. Blueprints is the visual scripting language in Unreal. Unity has Bolt, amongst other visual scripting languages. Today, our games are very sophisticated. It would be nearly impossible to write everything from scratch for each game. Therefore, we build on top of software systems developed by others, most notably the operating system, which controls the computer hardware. As I have mentioned, the operating system and hardware together, we often refer to as the platform. Above the operating system is often middleware, which usually provides our core game systems, such as graphics rendering, physics, etc. The game logic leverages and speaks to these systems through what is known as the Application Programming Interface, or API. A lot of game development has become learning the API to interface with the middleware and the operating system. Of course, the middleware is often bundled together in what we refer to as the game engine. In this class, the game engine that we have focused on is Unity. Unity and Unreal are the two most popular game engines used in the industry today. But there are many others, including the CryEngine, Lumberyard, Godot, and many others. Most engines come with additional sets of tools called editors. The editors help make creating games easier and more approachable. Artists and designers can get more involved with the process, which in turn makes better games. Take a few minutes to explore other game engines on the internet. Start by Googling List of Game Engines to find the Wikipedia page of that name. This page contains a table of over 150 game engines. The engines I list on this slide are ones to take particular note of. Pause the video now to do this. Within the operating system, there is a special software component whose job is to interface with a variety of different types of graphics processing hardware. Then, through an API, the game engine or game logic directly can then take advantage of all the hardware has to offer without having to deal with the complexity of each piece of hardware. Microsoft has DirectX for this purpose. Apple has what they call Metal, and OpenGL is a cross-platform API for graphics. Game engines such as Unity often will work with DirectX, Metal, and OpenGL, depending on the target platform you're deploying your game to. And at times, you have the option to pick the graphics engine. Generally, you'll use DirectX on Microsoft hardware, Metal on Apple hardware, and OpenGL when the other two are not available. The primary target game platforms we focus on across this course include PC games on Windows, Mac, and to some extent Linux operating systems, web games via the WebGL technology, and mobile gaming such as on smartphones and tablets running iOS and Android operating systems. Of course, home console and handhelds are also important gaming platforms. While we reference them in this course, as I mentioned, there is a much higher bar of entry to acquire the hardware and licenses to actually develop games for those platforms and distribute them. So they will not be our primary focus. However, the knowledge and skills we are learning can definitely apply towards developing games for almost any modern or emerging game platform. Let's conclude our discussion of game technology by looking at where games are played. Arcades are a shared social experience. It often is just as entertaining to watch other players play in the arcade as it is to play yourself. The games can be single-player experiences, but the arcade really shines with local multiplayer. Arcade machines can be customized to the game, including the internal hardware, the inputs, and the cabinet itself. From the traditional cabinet like in Miss Pac-Man, to the multiplayer cabinets of Street Fighter, to the dance pad of DDR, to the full cockpit of the Jurassic Park first-person shooter, to the fully immersive, full-motion VR simulator rides. I personally worked on a 12-player arcade game called Plunder Panic, where we built a custom arcade cabinet out of a rum barrel, a sail, and treasure chest to match the pirate theming in the game. This was a very cool experience for me to break outside of just working on the game's software to creating an entire themed experience. Of course, the arcade needs to pay for its real estate as well as for the games, so the games must be designed in a way to promote coin drop or card swipe, or something that keeps the player spending money within the arcade or barcade venue. In the home office, the player is typically playing on a personal computer in an upright chair at a table or desk. They are often close to the screen. The input devices are typically a keyboard and mouse. Their PC often has lots of storage, so the games can be very sophisticated and deep. The player is usually the only one in the space, so it is a solitary experience, at least within the room. But of course, they usually have networking capability, so multiplayer games are popular on the PC. But they also often use the computer for other things, like work or school, so games may also serve as a casual break between tasks. Console games are typically played from a comfy, laid-back chair in the living room. The space is much more of a shared social experience than the home office, but more intimate than the arcade. That is, you share the space with family and friends, not strangers like the arcade. The console is likely connected to a larger display and higher fidelity audio than gaming in the home office, so players are often seeking a more immersive, cinematic experience. Players are typically using game controllers that are designed for gaming versus the more utilitarian keyboard and mouse, but the controllers may not be as customized or streamlined as the arcade controls, since they need to work for many games, not just one. And last but not least, mobile and handheld games are often played on the go, in between spaces. The player may be playing in the few moments they have before the bus comes, or before they're called in for an appointment. This leads to more casual, shorter game experiences, though deeper, longer play games are now common as well. Given that they are playing in potentially locations where it is not appropriate to make noise, they may have the sound turned off, or may be wearing headphones. The size of the device means that most games are local single player, but given that most of these devices are constantly connected to a network and nearly everyone has them, means mobile devices are perfect networked multiplayer machines. Of course, the screen size is much more limited given the small size of these devices. Players are often interfacing them primarily through the touchscreen, so the controls need to be simplified, sometimes made larger in relation to the overall screen size to make them touchable. Further, the player may also block the screen while providing input, so this is another game design challenge when creating games for mobile. Of course, wherever our players play, it is all about the games. In the video that follows, Stuart Brown gives a brief history of video games as part of his Ahoy YouTube series. This video does a good job of showing major games across time and relates it to some of the game technology history I've discussed in this lecture. I think it makes a nice conclusion to my talk. Please give it a watch. Good work! You got to the end of the second step in the game design and development specialization. You may be waiting for the final assessment of your project. If that's the case, please help out your fellow learners by doing as many peer reviews as you can of their projects. Not only will it help your fellow learners get through the course, you can get inspiration and learn a lot by looking at other people's work. And providing constructive feedback on others' work and learning to receive criticism on your own work are both very important skills to develop as game developers. You should now have completed 2 games in Unity and learned a ton along the way. I hope you will continue on to the next course, where we will learn more about game development by building a 3D shooter game. We will also discuss several intermediate game development techniques while continuing to discuss game design concepts. Best wishes and come back soon to continue your journey into game design and development.